Good evening and welcome. My name is Harmony Barker, and I am the Assistant Manager of Public Programs at the 9/11 Memorial and Museum. It's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program, The Targeter: How to Hunt Terrorists. As always, I'd like to extend a special welcome to our museum members and to those tuning into our live web broadcast at 911memorial.org/live. Tonight, we are very pleased to be joined by Neda Bakos, author of The Targeter: My Life in the CIA, Hunting Terrorists and Challenging the White House. Neda Bakos is a highly regarded national security and intelligence expert with 20 years of experience. As a CIA analyst, she was a key member of the team charged with analyzing the relationship between Iraq, al-Qaeda, and the 9/11 attacks. During the war in Iraq, she served as the chief targeting officer tracking Abu Musab AlZarqawi, the founder of al-Qaeda in Iraq, which later became ISIS. Al-Zarqawi was killed in a targeted strike in 2006. In The Targeter, she takes us behind the scenes for a look inside the world of high-stakes foreign intelligence and her role within the campaign to stop top-tier targets inside al-Qaeda. Neda has been featured in the PBS Frontline show The Secret History of ISIS and the Emmy Award-winning HBO documentary Manhunt. She has also appeared as a guest commentator on CNN, ABC, Fox, and MSNBC, to name a few, and frequently serves as a resource for journalists at the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and other media outlets. We'd like to thank Neda for sharing her time and insights with us. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Neda Bakos in conversation with Executive Vice President and Deputy Director for Museum Programs, Clifford Channon.
Thank you, Harmony. Neda, welcome. I want to add a word to Harmony's introduction because we met, it was over 2 years ago. We were on the West Coast actually to do an interview for the exhibition, Revealed: The Hunt for Bin Laden. And through the network of former colleagues, Neda agreed to sit with us. And it was that conversation, like a number of others we had with former colleagues of yours, that really opened up the picture of what the work that you did and your colleagues did was, and allowed us to think very differently about what the exhibition might be able to present if we got the right cooperation, et cetera, et cetera. But, you know, hearing you then speak about that work really was very important in the way we began to think about doing the exhibition. So I was particularly looking forward to your book and the opportunity to talk to you. And I will tell you, having finished the book this weekend, it does not disappoint. It really does get into, well, you know, yes, I wasn't going to lead all the way up to just drop it like that, but, you know, it really sort of brings you into the tensions, the stresses, but also the sense of accomplishment that went up and down for you. I don't think it's an exaggeration to state, during your time there. So we will talk about the different phases of your career at the CIA, but I think it's important to start to ask you how you came to the CIA, because there is a 9/11 reason behind your work there.
Actually, I joined the CIA before 9/11. I was very focused on working overseas, and there wasn't a lot of opportunity at the time when I first graduated from undergrad. And so as I spent, you know, part of my career working various, you know, professional jobs, I saw an ad in The Economist and ended up applying online in 1999.
Right, but you were in HR at first at the CIA.
I was hired as an analyst to do strategic development, essentially. So we were looking at how they were allocating resources in their operations side with, you know, human resources and finances, and trying to bring them out of that OSS World War II paradigm and shift them into like a modern workforce.
Right, right. So even the CIA has an HR department, which, you know, you've got to have one. But you wanted to get into the action, and you wanted to move. And it's interesting, again, from the outside, to think that, you know, the HR function is an entry point, but you can move elsewhere within the organization. So how did that proceed for you?
So after 9/11, I was working as basically volunteering part of my hours during the day and later in the evening within the Counterterrorism Center. And that work was what I was most interested in. I was really actually focused on wanting to work in what was then called the Directorate of Intelligence, and now I think it's Directorate of Analysis, but that's where all the analysts work. And so I ended up applying for a job that was in line with my academic background, which is in economics.
You talk about analysis and becoming an analyst. One of the interesting things that we learned in, again, developing the exhibition was, the specific differences among the different jobs. I mean, it's kind of a continuum of work, and some of the work product gets handed off from one to the other. But in those early days, as an analyst working on counterterrorism, what were you focusing on?
In the early days in the Counterterrorism Center, I was focused on answering the question of whether or not al-Qaeda and 9/11 were affiliated in any way with Iraq and Saddam Hussein's government. And which is an odd way to go about answering an intelligence question. Typically, the way that teams are set up within the CIA and the intelligence community is to answer an intel national security objective, whether it's through policy resources that policymakers are interested in something, or it's something that's predetermined through strategic planning that actually takes place.
So the challenge that was put to you was to try to find a connection that, at least initially, was very hard to find. It turned out not to be findable because it didn't exist. But rather than coming to you and saying, what does the intelligence show you about this question, there was a focus on trying to get a particular answer to a particular question. Is that
right.
Fair to say?
That is exactly what happened. And in fairness to the policymaker and to elements within the White House and the Pentagon who were interested in answering that question in a specific way, the agency didn't have a lot of really good collection about al-Qaeda and Iraq's support to terrorism. What kind of terrorist organizations was Iraq supporting at the time? So they did have a blind spot because it wasn't a preeminent question, because there hadn't been any indications that Iraq was supporting any significant terrorist organizations.
Right. But it seemed to be driven by a broader purpose.
100%.
Yeah. And so how did that translate for you? At that point, you're more junior in your career, so whatever was coming in wouldn't have come directly to you. It would have come to some managers or supervisor, whoever it was. But what was that as they were experiencing it, to your knowledge? And how did it, if it did, translate to what you were doing?
So policymakers at that time had a way of asking analyst questions without going directly to the analyst. So it would be funneled through one specific office at the CIA, typically, and then passed down to the managers at the working level. For us, we had direct connectivity with the White House because of the question. So that was completely unusual. But my immediate boss also had been a briefer for Vice President Cheney at one point. So she had had a personal relationship with him, understood his mindset, and anticipated what he was going to be looking for. So she structured it so that we were building all of the analysis. And this is typical of CIA, where you put together an entire intelligence assessment and give it to them in one paper. And that's what we were compiling prior to the war.
And so did it feel abnormal at that point, or was this, as you were experiencing it, within the realm of
It was
expected?
Abnormal.
It was.
Because my immediate boss was not a senior level executive, essentially, within the CIA. The connectivity that she had with the White House, that was completely unusual for her level. Not for nothing, the rest of the CIA was focused on other things within the Counterterrorism Center. I mean, al-Qaeda and Afghanistan and Pakistan at that point. So we were just kind of left to our own resources to go ahead and have that connectivity and manage it, which my boss actually did pretty well.
And I wonder what it looked like from the 7th floor of the executive headquarters of the CIA to have had this direct connection elsewhere in the building from the White House.
Yeah, I mean, they did get to see, obviously, the information that we were sending out and the questions that were coming in. But the vice president, and this actually was in the news, had actually visited CIA headquarters directly to meet with us, which that's very unusual. Yeah.
So this is in the lead up to the war in Iraq, but also, of course, after the war in Iraq is underway. And there are a couple of focuses for the intelligence gathering. The connection you mentioned, real or not, between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda, but also the search for weapons of mass destruction. But those were two separate tracks.
Yeah.
Did that emerge naturally as two separate tracks? Would there have been a thought that those might have been two related subjects, or how did that go?
So they're related in the sense that there are sources that actually had information on both tracks. There's substantively, we were different analysts. The weapons of mass destruction analysts had typically a science background, something in weapon systems, so that they understood all of the science behind this and how to analyze it. The rest of us had more of a background, either geographic or something on terrorism, so that we were able to answer those questions. But we had we had same sources that we were pulling from for information. And one of the sources didn't seem to line up on our side. The information they were giving on terrorist organizations and al-Qaeda, we had not seen anywhere else. We couldn't verify it through any other means.
And was that making a connection between Iraq and al-Qaeda, or what?
Trying to make a connection between Iraq and al-Qaeda.
Okay, so he or she was telling you that this was a connection to explore further.
Yes.
And was that source the same who was talking about weapons of mass destruction?
He was also talking about weapons of mass destruction.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so providing favorably disposed information that the administration might have wanted to you, but not something that you could support with other information.
Correct. And so we spelled all of that out for the policymaker. Essentially called the paper the Bible at the time, because it was so large, what we had actually delivered to the White House and to the Pentagon and to the senior cabinet policymakers. And we talk about the veracity of the information in there. We talk about the fact that we can't vet this information anywhere else, and that this is a standalone item, and we are unable to corroborate this. So
I'm curious as to how you are trained to do this, because as you say, this wasn't particularly your background, and in any case, going to the CIA requires training to become whatever your function is in the CIA. So what was the means by which you were given the ultimate responsibility that you were given to be an analyst on this stuff?
So the CIA has two jobs that are kind of at the pointy end of the spear. One of them is a case officer, which you typically see in movies like James Bond. They recruit someone to spy on behalf of the United States. They recruit somebody who's called an asset or an agent. And then the other one is the analyst, which you don't hear about as often, because evidently it doesn't make for a great movie, but I disagree.
Oh, by the way, yes.
So we go, the case officers go through the farm, which is, typically you've heard of that, even in Hollywood. And then the analysts go through what's something called the Career Analyst Program. And we're writing constantly being tested. But first, before we even join the organization or that side of the organization, we have to pass a battery of tests to be able to qualify as an analyst. So it has to be a certain mindset, somebody who's has capability in certain areas, not just substantively, but they're testing you for logical sequencing and see what you have executive function skills that they're looking for. But the Career Analyst Program itself, it's not like we get to learn how to shoot a gun. We did nerdy things like, we got to do exercises. One of them actually that was most impactful for me was an exercise on the Rwanda genocide. And it was looking at all the information as it was coming in, as if it was real time, that when it was happening for the analysts that were working the account when the genocide was occurring. And you were supposed to be, just from the information you're getting, figuring out, what do I tell the policymaker is happening on the ground, and how do I assess this with the dynamics within the region? So it's actually, it's really, really interesting training, and I think it's probably some of the most interesting training within the intelligence community, but that's just my nerdy take on it.
But just to take the Rwanda case study a little further, I assume there was a range of conclusions that were drawn by the different analysts, but
yes.
I guess the point is, it's not clear in the moment what is going to happen.
Correct.
And yet, these momentous things happen. Yeah. So you become an analyst in this question of Iraq, and at some point relatively soon, you volunteer to go overseas and to serve with the other intelligence agencies, with the military, so that the intelligence analysis and a link back to the CIA can be quicker and stronger because someone is going to be, not just you alone, but some team of CIA officers is going to be on the ground available to the military.
Right.
First off, what was your thinking in deciding to go over there?
That's a good question. Retrospectively, I know now I had absolutely zero idea what I was getting into. I got off the airplane. I didn't even know where to go. I was volunteering because at the time I was still trying to prove myself as an analyst and run up the ladder as fast as I can, which was my personality. And I was the second person from our branch to go into Iraq after the invasion. And we were exactly as you described. We were the link back to headquarters, especially to our team, to deal with any other unanswered questions or other information that might come up about Iraq's support for terrorism.
So we explored a bit in the exhibition, you certainly do in your book, this idea of having to break the silos between the agencies, the various intelligence agencies, but even in this case, more importantly, between the intelligence community and the military. So you get over there in the early phases of this, and I wonder if you could describe the transformation that you saw or didn't see at that point in time. How was that better integration, which I think eventually did happen to a much larger degree than existed initially?
Right.
How did that look to you at that early point?
At the early point, it was total chaos, and we were in charge of our own operations, our own daily tasks, essentially. But I called him, we had a local SEAL that was living with us, not the animal, but the guys who were in special forces. Basically living on the same compound that we were living on, essentially just to be available at a moment's notice and get the rest of DevGru ready to go once we had a target. So it was actually kind of interesting in the sense of, I don't really think that had been done before, especially at that level. I mean, so much planning typically goes into all of those types of raids. The initial reaction right after the invasion, it was pretty much chaos, for better or worse. So, it was left to us underlings to figure out what do we do with our day and how do we contribute to this mission.
So that, I take your point that there's a lot going on, and how you get organized is going to take time. But it also seems at the same point that you sort of knew you needed each other in a way that maybe wasn't institutionalized until later.
Right.
So can you tell us about, an example of a particular mission or moment where the benefit of working more closely together, which again seems logical today, but at that point was not really the standard practice. Is there a particular moment that you remember or a story you can tell us that indicates to you all, this is really something we really need to do more of?
So my expertise was the Iraqi intelligence service. And the Iraqi intelligence service had many different directorates within the service itself. Some were responsible for assassinations. Some were responsible for basically terrorist types of activities. And others were responsible for collecting information, just like any other intelligence organization. And because I knew who all the main players were, and I understand sort of their MO, who worked for them, I had like an entire org chart scoped out as to who was in the organization and who we thought actually would still be influential after the invasion and still be inside of Iraq. So when they would pick up guys who were part of the Iraqi intelligence service, I would go along on the raids, on some of these operations, and then I would be the substantive person who would ask the questions through the translator to figure out, is this person a bomb maker? Is this person higher within one of the directorates we're most interested in? These weren't people that you were seeing on the deck of cards. I don't know if you remember that. After the invasion, where it was like everybody from Saddam's government was on a deck of cards. It was like their wanted poster, so that all the Marines that had this deck of cards, supposedly, should be able to recognize these people. But these guys weren't on those deck of cards. But they were actually, a lot of these people ended up joining al-Qaeda in Iraq. I mean, these are the people that really we should have been focusing on.
And so you would go out with them, and would you interrogate people at the scene of the raid, or would you all come back and work it at a headquarters setting?
Depends, and both. And I would use the word headquarters very roughly. It was more like a blown out airport hangar, with plywood shack thing inside. So it would just depend on the objective on the raid.
So you describe as sort of a way of sort of bringing life to the kind of networking analysis you're doing. There is, I mean, if you've seen the Homeland series, you know Carrie Matheson has filled an entire apartment at one point in the series with this incredible network of maps. But that's not a completely fictionalized version of how you all worked at that point.
I mean, that's true that we did use network analysis, but not like crazy Carrie.
I'm a little disappointed, I have to
say. Because that can be overworked. That was actually part of the problem. So it's like, if you were not trained in some of this intelligence analysis and how you would structure your intel and vet the information, you can literally network your way to everyone being tied to Kevin Bacon. I mean, that was the joke at the time. It's like, oh, that's another network chart, and I'll say from the military, we'll find Kevin Bacon in that one somewhere, because it was just like this entire network of all of Iraq. You know, so that's what it would look like eventually. But.
So you describe it as these charts as representing the very height of the U.S. modern intelligence gathering capabilities, and simultaneously reminded me of an elaborate Old West wanted poster. So it had, you know, a very focused dimension, but also it was the product of an incredible intelligence gathering effort.
Yes.
So you begin to do these interrogations, and it seems like at a certain point, I can't recall how long your tour was, but you are feeling frustrated with just how things are being organized and whether or not there's sort of a strategic purpose for a lot of the things you're doing.
Oh, from the first day. I mean, I knew, before the invasion, this doesn't make a lot of sense. What is the point in this when we have all these resources that we need to throw at al-Qaeda and dealing with Afghanistan now that we've done an entire land invasion? But that was easy for me to think at the time. I didn't fully understand the WMD case because I wasn't a weapons analyst. I didn't see all the inside baseball information. But it was probably like the second or third day that I was there, I was thinking, nobody knows what to do. There's no plan. We had leadership, and the CIA has an objective, and we knew all of that. But other than that, it was just, the country was just in shambles. And shortly after, they had, with their de-Baathification, the Ba'ath Party was what was under Saddam, they fired everybody essentially from all of their jobs. So you have like an entire country who is now unemployed and with no money, very little, they're not getting access to food. What do you have left to do?
Yeah. Some of the interrogations that you saw there, and some of it I think also continued after you had returned to Washington in a different role, which we'll talk about. But this was also a separation between some of the military handling of the detainees, and at least in your part of this, the CIA handling of how this should be done. So tell us about that sort of split.
Right. So within Afghanistan and other pursuits of al-Qaeda Central, quite often the CIA, especially at that time, had primacy over those operations. In Iraq, this was an actual war where Congress voted to go to war against Iraq. So military actually had primacy inside of Iraq, so they handled the detainees and everything within, that whole structure. So it wasn't like these guys were going to black sites being waterboarded. They were staying in the country.
But they were kept under very difficult conditions, and there were some questionable tactics used that were under a different aegis. We're not really talking about the enhanced interrogation program at this point. I think we're talking about a much larger number of people, some of whom are simply just kept in detention for no particular reason, it would appear. But it seems from reading your book that you found this was counterproductive to the kind of intelligence gathering that you were there to do.
It definitely was It was alienating people who may have been working with the United States, whether it's, working with the CIA to help spy, or if it was working with the United States to help rebuild the country. We weren't making friends, that's for sure.
Yeah. So you go back to Washington. I can't recall how long your tour was. It was...
My first one was just a couple months.
Right. And you go back, and you're back in the office. You're still working on these issues. What has changed in your sense of what you're doing, what you're contributing to this, how the operation within the CIA is being directed after you get back from Iraq?
When I get back, I realize, and I mean, I knew it then because I was the one on the receiving end of some of these questions, we were still getting so many questions from the White House on the historic, backward looking, whether or not we had found a connection yet between Iraq and al-Qaeda. And at this point, the country is starting to ignite. When I had returned, a couple of bombings, the UN bombing and a major mosque in the southern part of Iraq were bombed by what we now know was al-Qaeda in Iraq. And I wrote what's called a presidential daily brief on one of those bombings. And all I could think of at the time was, this is what we should be paying attention to. It's not like we didn't know Zarqawi was there. We knew he was there in the run-up to the war, so ends up leading al-Qaeda in Iraq. He was stationed in northern Iraq, in Kermal, with another native terrorist organization called Ansar al-Islam. And I was able to make a connection to him on that bombing. And I'm thinking, why are we still asking all of these, historic questions?
So the focus of where the threat to the U.S. is coming from at this point, the U.S. troops and so on, obviously it's a concern, but it's not yet really directing the main focus or the full focus of the agency and the intelligence community. But you then latch on to Abu Musab AlZarqawi, who you mentioned, who has a history that had already drawn the attention of U.S. intelligence, but not with any real focus until much later. So give us the background on him, because he became the full focus of what you would then turn to do.
Yeah. So he was actually Jordanian who had just grown up on the streets of Jordan. He had grown up in Zarqa, which, when it was first settled, was a Palestinian refugee area. And it was largely lower middle income, if not poverty level, throughout the city. And his family was not wealthy. He spent a lot of time dealing drugs. He was a pimp at one point. He was in and out of jail, and in one of his stints in jail, he ended up meeting who became his spiritual advisor. His last name was Makdisi. He ended up radicalizing him in jail, which is like such a common, we hear about this over and over and over again, but we don't do anything differently. He was radicalized, and he just became this, major ideological extremist.
And he begins to develop a following. Now he goes to Afghanistan.
Yes. So he goes to Afghanistan. He's in Afghanistan. He's co-located with al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda doesn't really see him as a major player. He doesn't really fit the mold of al-Qaeda. And he's not really interested in al-Qaeda's primary objective. He just wants to attack the Jordanian kingdom at that point.
And how do you describe al-Qaeda's primary objective at that point?
Al-Qaeda is focused on the United States.
Okay.
Yeah.
So he wants to take the fight back to Jordan.
Correct.
Okay. So please continue with.
So then after 9/11, and we've invaded Afghanistan, he flees. He spends a little bit of time in northern Iran, and then eventually ends up in northern Iraq. And he's co-located with this organization, Ansar al-Islam, and largely because he had other connections back to that organization. He had recruited people out of the Caucasus, some out of the Levant, and so he had people that were also in Ansar al-Islam as contacts. So he built this really rudimentary poisons laboratory in northern Iraq prior to the invasion.
And so he is on the CIA radar, but maybe not a prime focus. The U.S. comes into Afghanistan, drives him out. Now the U.S. turns to invasion of Iraq. How does his activity and profile begin to mount?
His profile rises when Colin Powell mentions him at the UN speech. So prior to that speech, my team was charged with making sure that everything within that speech was accurate from the perspective of whatever the ties were to terrorism, between Iraq and terrorism that we knew at the time. That speech had many iterations that went back and forth, and after it left us, it had more iterations and was changed again within the White House. So by the time it was delivered, we were scratching our heads, wondering what version this is, because it certainly went off track. We were sitting there with a version of the speech that we had given them, and it wasn't the same.
So Secretary of State then, Colin Powell, says that Zarqawi, on behalf of al-Qaeda, is linked with the Saddam Hussein government. Therefore, making the connection to 9/11. Now, none of that is accurate.
No, and he doesn't explicitly say it. He just talks about the fact that he was co-located with al-Qaeda. He's a sympathizer of al-Qaeda. Talks about his network a little bit. And on the chart, you know, that you have some al-Qaeda members that they're showing on the slide. So it makes it appear as if he has this really strong link to al-Qaeda.
Did you ever find out how those changes were made and those assertions were put forward?
Yeah, actually, I had a very interesting conversation. I recorded a podcast with one of my old senior bosses, Mike Morrell. So we had an interesting discussion after we hit stop on the recording.
I see. And which part of that conversation can you tell us here?
Not the part when we hit stop.
Okay.
But I mean, the iterations really happened within the Pentagon and the White House.
Yeah. You then are going to leave the CIA.
Eventually.
Yes. Yeah. And you turn to a different job in this process, the job of targeter.
Yeah.
So you're not going to be an analyst. A targeter does something else, and your principal target is going to be Zarqawi himself. So describe first the targeter's job. I believe it was sort of newly developed because of the need to focus on particular folks or particular networks, and how different that is from being an analyst.
So we'll go back a little bit. Before 9/11, there's a group of women analysts. It's not Alex Station that you hear about so often within the Counterterrorism Center within CIA. There's a group of women analysts, some of which appear in your video on the Reveal exhibit, that had the expertise in al-Qaeda and were writing presidential daily briefs warning the U.S. government about possible impending attacks. Just don't know when and where. And those women loosely worked at the time as a targeting officer, providing strategic and tactical intelligence to any kind of action arm, whether it's another government or it's U.S. military or whoever has primacy over that target, for them to be able to either, most of the time at that time was to capture.
Right. So I think it's important to say targeting is simply bringing focused attention onto a person.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily involve literally targeting with weapons, although it may come to that.
Right.
Okay, just to clarify.
Yes.
So that's a function that exists, but it seems like at a later point, when the shooting is underway in both Afghanistan and Iraq, it takes on a much greater importance within the operation of the agency.
Yeah. So I moved to the operations side to become a targeting officer. So you use the same skill set as an analyst, but you're using it in a much more tactical way, so that you need to understand the landscape and the overarching issue with the structure of the organization, but yet at the same time, you're now drilling down into specific people or groups or places, and your objective then is to, like you said, where it's snatch and grab, or sometimes it is a kill mission.
But the most important thing in many of these cases is to actually be able to find the person.
Absolutely.
And so the hunt for Zarqawi becomes increasingly important as his organization becomes more and more deadly, targeting not just American troops and foreign troops, but normal Iraqis. He had very specific goals for why a campaign of spreading violence was critical to his strategy. So let's talk about those goals.
He killed tens of thousands of Iraqis. He saw anybody who was not an adherent specifically to their extremist ideology as an infidel, whether they were Muslim or not. And his way of trying to control the population, of course, was through fear. And it was to murder and slaughter people who were not abiding by what he was wanting them to do. And he didn't have territorial control like you saw with ISIS and a caliphate at this point. He is literally just trying to add chaos so that the U.S. government is having to deal with a lot more than just some of the insurgency from the former Saddam regime members, in addition to trying to control the local population.
So violence is his method of terror and control, and most of it is targeted on Iraqis. Now, this involves suicide bombings and various kinds of IED attacks and so on and so forth.
He was the first terrorist, and this just seems like such an obvious thing to do now, but he was the first terrorist to do what's called multiple VBIED, so a vehicle-borne improvised explosive device. So he had 2 basically delivery trucks wired with a large amount of explosives. And that's actually how they ended up attacking the UN building. And that was the first time that tactic had been used.
So he would send one in
right after the other.
And so
first one would kill typically guards and any of that for, frontline security. And the second one would go in and take out the building.
I see. At this point, though, he's not clearly affiliated with al-Qaeda. How does that emerge?
So because now he's become so prominent, al-Qaeda has lost resources, drawn down. My colleagues in the other part of the building are just doing their job very well. I mean, they've strangled al-Qaeda at this point, and they're taking a lot of the oxygen out of the organization. Well, at the same time, they also lose some visibility into al-Qaeda because al-Qaeda has very much gone to ground. Zarqawi is the opposite. He's garnering all this world stage attention. And so now al-Qaeda is paying attention.
What years are we talking about?
So this
roughly?
is around 2004.
Okay.
Yeah. And he's having these conversations back and forth with al-Qaeda Central and al-Qaeda leadership. And they're approaching him to hopefully convince him to join the organization. But at the same time, they want to control him. And he's interested in joining the organization because that just gives him even more legitimacy and more money and more recruits. And he's really the only one doing anything on the world stage at that point as far as a jihadist. But al-Qaeda has lots of conditions. They want him to stop killing Muslims. They see that as an issue. That's not part of their charter. But he doesn't. He argues about this point and basically says, I'm going to do it my way. And it was like the first time in my life I'm reading this. It was as we first see this first letter, this exchange, and I'm thinking, how is it I could possibly sitting here thinking bin Laden's right? Like that's how bad this guy is. When bin Laden seems to be the rational person in the conversation.
And so he is really having an extraordinary impact on what is going on in Iraq. So your job then, with colleagues, of course, is to figure out how to track him by virtue of what means. How do you go about looking for someone like that?
Oh, you're vacuuming up all the intelligence you can get from the sources that you're really super interested in. So it was everything. Technical collection, SIGINT, all of that stuff, in addition to as much human as you can possibly get, and working with allies and the coalition. At that point, we are really building their pattern of life and what this organization looks like and what motivates them. And we thankfully had some of my colleagues who had worked on this issue in the 90s had scoped out some of his closer contacts. We had a pretty good idea of who his Shura council would be, who his possible successor might be, and those kinds of things. And
so you're not just looking for him at that point.
Oh, yeah.
You're looking for the network around him.
Yeah.
And how do you begin to break into that network and find some of the key allies that he has?
Initially, I just kind of took over this operations group when I moved into the operations side as a targeting officer. And I just started assigning people other leadership members and then logistical nodes. So you take this logistical node. You take, where are they getting the funnel? Where are they funneling the money from? I want to be able to find people that are impacting this. And we were just trying to find vulnerabilities within all these insertion points. And thankfully, I had some really experienced analysts working on the team that were able to put together the pattern of life pieces on some of the leadership. And we took out some of the leadership kind of early on. After, I don't know if you remember Nicholas Berg. He was an American that was caught by Zarqawi's organization. And then they killed him on video. And it was one of the first sort of graphic videos that was passed around. But yeah, it takes some, an effort that's community-wide for sure to be able to collect all of that.
So is it that then you turn to the military and say, here's a place where this person could be.
Right.
Let's focus on that. Or is it that they happen to sweep some of these people up and bring them to your attention? How does that work?
Right. So initially, the action arm is military inside of Iraq. So initially, we would go to big military and give them this information. But the machine within that at the time, we hadn't quite figured out this like really simpatico way to work together. It was slow. And by the time it would come back around to targeting that place, they're gone. So I started actually having somebody go to Iraq and embed with General McChrystal's team.
So General McChrystal is running the Special Operations Group, and that's the group that is dealing with speed as the key element in turning this stuff over. So you send someone who is now part of McChrystal's team, thinking about the purpose of one raid after another. And what impact do you see from that exchange?
Initially, we had, it was really interesting because this was kind of one of the first times that we really had this sort of collaboration in real time, right? Within the two bureaucratic structures, there's usually all these agreements that have to be made and everybody's got to be on board and there's all these decision making. This is the first time we're at the working level, we were able to work really together. And we had an exception so that we could give them raw intelligence, which is unusual from that perspective also. And our analysts knew how to deliver information that wasn't yet released that we could actually verbally talk through in a legal sense. So we were working around some of the legal hurdles, but at the same time, trying to figure out how to plug into that and be able to give them that information real time.
And you and they were seeing better results from their missions as a result of this kind of collaboration.
Yeah.
So you're beginning to pick off some of the key people.
Yes.
And what sort of leads does that give you towards Zarqawi? Because there are a couple of close calls with Zarqawi.
Yeah.
And I think they're fascinating. I mean, the book really tracks them very well, but tell us about how that evolved.
When you end up finding patterns of life and just like a glimpse to where somebody like Zarqawi might be or where he's currently staying, you have to act on that very quickly, or that will be gone.
Because they're very conscious of their security
Absolutely.
as
well. He's very concerned with his operational security, and we knew at the time he was traveling not with a big entourage, right? He was traveling with like one or two other people. Sometimes he had one of his wives with him. They were largely staying in I think mostly the Fallujah area or Anbar province. But we had some information that he would be traveling, and so we didn't have drones like you hear about now where they're armed. They just had cameras, essentially.
Right. The early drones were not weapons. They were surveillance.
Well, at least in Iraq,
yeah.
We did not have armed drones. Because, again, we were not the primacy for taking action. So we ended up being able to get what's called ISR. We're following this white pickup for a while. And eventually figure out this, there's two individuals in there. This looks plausible. This seems like a signature that's probably him. At that point, Special Forces ends up being able to catch up, and then they try to, tag the vehicle so that they're able to pull him over. Well, he figures out who's following him, even though they're in essentially another white Toyota, and speeds off. And he starts outrunning them, but they weren't super close, but they pulled into a grove of trees.
He did.
He pulled into a grove of trees with a driver, and they got out and ran. And at the time, the ISR, for whatever the visibility coverage was that day, we couldn't see. We couldn't even see like a heat signature of the person.
And you're
so
watching
we don't know
this
where
as
he
it's
went.
happening?
Yes.
You're watching this back in Washington.
Yes.
And
screaming.
I was about to ask. Yeah. So okay. So he's in the woods or in the trees.
Yeah.
And he's now lost to your view.
Yeah. He's lost to our view. By the time they pull up, they can't find.
He's gone.
Yeah. He's gone. Took dogs. But he's gone. So ended up getting stuff that he left behind in the pickup.
So he left if I remember, a laptop, and so you now have more to go on.
Yeah.
What does the laptop do for you in terms of building the picture?
Well, that particular laptop, when we get stuff like that, that's typically, it's gold. Because if you take that information in and you do it within the first hours of capturing that information, you can usually beat those guys ahead of them trying to either destroy what it is that you've come upon, whether it's phone numbers, those kinds of things that you can geolocate, or if it's information about some of their contacts and where they are, and then you can go in and arrest those guys.
Yeah.
But this particular laptop in this particular instance ended up not going to some of the elements within the government who could actually pull the information off very quickly. There's some of the bureaucratic infighting that started.
So there was some resistance from the military in handing it over for quicker intelligence analysis.
Yeah.
So
2 weeks later, we got it.
2 weeks later, which means
pretty much
that's gone. That's gone. So that was moment number one. Were there other times where you thought you had him and he slipped away?
There was one other time that was a near mess. Yeah.
And then, but you're picking apart the network at the same time. Did you find it was able to regenerate in a way that kept it viable all this time?
So not necessarily at the core leadership level or even that second tier ring right away, but almost everywhere else, those nodes would pop back up. Yeah.
And was this spontaneous, do you think, or was the network deeply entrenched enough so that it could regenerate through efforts of recruiters or whoever it would be?
So Zarqawi was really into not having a very hierarchical structure like al-Qaeda. His organization was flat. And he would empower his people to go ahead and make decisions. So if there was a node that was taken out somewhere in Anbar province that was essential to either security or logistics or whatever it was, moving people in and out of the border, the network itself would take care of that.
So now Zarqawi does meet his end through U.S. efforts, but at that point, you have moved out of this work into sort of domestic liaison with JTTF and other sort of domestic law enforcement agencies. So tell us how you learned of the successful finding of Zarqawi, and tell us about how he was found and then how you learned about it.
So about 3 months before Zarqawi was found, I think it was 3 or 4 months, I moved on to another job. I had stayed probably the longest on this team of anybody, and it was Burnout in addition to I was just getting disgruntled with how we were conducting the operations, and it was just like this daisy chaining our way through Iraq, hitting all these different targets constantly. To me, that just didn't seem to be a very effective way to go about doing this. So when I moved to the other job, I actually found out I was with other colleagues, and I was in a hotel lobby, and they told me when I walked off the elevator what had happened. They were like, look at the cryon on CNN.
And he had, so how did that mission unfold?
So the U.S. military actually captured an individual that they obviously interrogated and broke down that gave him the information to find him through a spiritual advisor also, not the one I had referred to earlier.
Right, and they're tracking him. I mean, it's a long, convoluted chase.
Yes.
Or they're not chasing him, but they're tracking him.
They're tracking him for a while.
And then there's a couple of bombs dropped on the location where they had found him.
So they don't send in personnel. They go ahead and drop bombs.
And he is then pulled out of the rubble, and he's not even dead at that point.
Nope.
And he is identified, and so he is confirmed dead at that point. And your reaction to this, far away from that?
I was relieved. Yeah. I mean, just to have that, he was a murderer of tens of thousands of people, let alone all the coalition forces he killed. He killed tens of thousands of Iraqis.
Yeah. You know, I guess it's extraordinary to see that happen, and yet, and we saw this with the bin Laden raid as well, it's not over when an individual is killed. And so, we had this conversation actually here last week with some other folks who were involved in helping advise us with the exhibition, who were part of the intelligence community.
Peter and Bruce.
Yeah, Peter and Bruce among them. And, the question becomes, are we seeing this, in seeing this as a war, are we actually misseeing what it is? The analogy to the Cold War of, you're not necessarily going to have an ending to this, you're just going to have to maintain over a period of time.
Yes.
Because the threat is there, and how you react is a different question, but you can't turn a blind eye to it. But on the other hand, if you call it a war, well, our understanding of war is that it ends with a treaty or a settlement or whatever it is, and then it's over. This is not that kind of situation, is it?
No, it is not. And I talk about that a little bit at the end of my book. And I also wrote a paper on that about 2 years ago. I'm a senior fellow with Foreign Policy Research Institute. And we did a product called After the Caliphate. So when ISIS had lost their territory. And ultimately, extremism, whether it's from white nationalists or it's from Islamic extremists, it grows and it flourishes within certain environments. When it's permissible for them to grow and flourish, they will. You will find attractors to those ideologies. And this is no exception. When people are, it's not always the same, profile of a person who is attracted to this, but typically it's somebody who wants to blame someone else for their problems. When you boil it down to that's ultimately what it is.
Yeah.
From really simplistic terms. So it's really the conditions around all of this that we have to start paying attention to, but those are not immediate, as accessible, and we don't have ultimate control over all of those.
Nor do we really know how to affect those circumstances in the right way.
Very well, right?
Yeah.
I mean, look at even the issue of climate change. When you look at scarcity of resources, that we know can cause people to lean on extremist tendencies and join extremist organizations. Iraq was a perfect test plot for that because we took all of those resources away, and then all of a sudden there was an insurgency. I mean, it's really not rocket science in some aspects.
Yeah. The other point that you come back to a number of times, which is interesting, and again, we had spoken to several of the people you mentioned in the book, is the role of women in the early days of all of this, and the al-Qaeda research and analysis before 9/11, post 9/11. The role of women in particularly the analytics side of the CIA, and I think more broadly within the intelligence community. It is not well known that many, if not most, of the key players within the intelligence community were women. And that's something that I think needs better understanding out there.
Yeah. So Harmony had mentioned the HBO documentary that I was interviewed in, and the director, Greg Barker, actually goes through and showcases a couple of those women who were there prior to 9/11 in the 90s, building the picture of who al-Qaeda is and looking at terrorism as an issue of extremist ideology.
So when you're within the CIA, within the Directorate of Analysis, there's a lot of women and fairly equally distributed through the hierarchy, I think you're right. When you move over to the Directorate of Operations, which is out there, that is not the same.
No, the gender equity was lacking at the time. It's much better now, from my understanding, but it was still this sort of OSS, Cold War mentality of, you have to be a man to be able to do that job, and then because those jobs are set up and structured so that they're overseas a lot, and if your family is living with you, it's really hard for your spouse to be able to work. So it has that,
It has that character to it. But I mean, the director of the agency now is a woman, and some significant number of her senior deputies
so as the director
are as well.
of operations is a woman. That's significant.
Yeah.
I did not think I would see that in my lifetime.
All right. Well, and so, how do you think the CIA has come through all of this? You mentioned before the burnout factor, and it is, having met a number of people there, it is something that comes up in conversation. The CIA has gone through, the extraordinary issue of the enhanced interrogation program and the rendition program, which have tainted to some degree the agency's reputation. Where do you see the agency now, having come through, let's face it, an extraordinary set of demands over years on a war footing, essentially, for these 18 years? Yeah,
and not a lot of self-awareness and acknowledgement around the impact that has on people. So by the time I left, there was no conversation of, you'd have to do a check-in with the Office of Medical Services, but it was a literal check-in to see if, you were a problem. It wasn't to actually be helpful. But now there's some mechanisms in place to help people with either developed PTSD or just, went through traumatic experiences doing the work. I think the agency is going to have a self-reckoning. I mean, there is probably right now they're going through challenges that are not related to, counterterrorism, but challenges nonetheless.
I mean, we can talk about that a little bit. In terms of the president and his disparagement of the intelligence community,
Right.
CIA included, what do you see as the impact of that on the folks who work in these agencies?
It ultimately has an impact, because not only is it, I can't say that it's, what he says personally hurts their feelings. That's not necessarily the case. But the problem is he dismisses the information. He changes the priorities that they're focusing on, which is extremely dangerous if it's only self-serving and not really focused on what the national security objectives are. And undermines largely what they're trying to do sometimes with allies, and props up adversaries like Russia.
Yeah. You go in a little bit at the end of the book to this idea of the search for, in the case of the war in Iraq, the government or the White House looking for a false narrative that could get behind to justify a policy. And in reading that, it's a kind of a foreshadowing of where we are today, because, again, you're looking for something that isn't borne out by the information that you have, but a political priority overtakes what the information can provide to you.
Yes. I mean, politicizing intelligence, which is what was happening.
Yeah.
Yes, and that's what's happening now. Whenever you take the analysis or raw intelligence and you turn it to just support your point, you can do that as a child. It's, as an adult and someone running the country, that's not very justifiable. I mean, my daughter can say that my son did something to her and convince me of it, but is it necessarily true? Ellie?
Perhaps not the best analogy given the audience here, but and it's maybe too soon to know in relation to current events.
Yeah.
But what's the impact on the agency of the events involving the manipulation of intelligence from the war in Iraq? Is it lasting?
Yeah, it was. So I know, my boss left, I left. I can think of 4 other people that were on that team that left. We had significant knowledge that should have probably stayed in the building, especially around al-Qaeda in Iraq that developed into ISIS. After I had left, I was thinking, I wish I could just go download my brain, for my colleagues that are there still, and give them, there's probably lots of information that I've just reading on a daily basis I could have helped weigh in on, but it definitely had an impact.
So it's people's departures, and
people's
then
departures.
Does the culture become more timid in some way, do you think?
I think it can, depending on the leadership. I think it also changed the structure, I think, of some of the intel products that were delivered. So a lot of it ended up funneling now through the DNI, whereas before,
Director of National Intelligence.
Director of National Intelligence, which we don't have one at the moment, but instead of being CIA primary products,
right.
then they moved into just being absorbed with the DIA with some other ones, DNI.
Yeah. So you don't always know what the consequences of this sort of thing
Correct.
are going to be.
Yep.
Yeah. Let's see if we have a question or two from the audience. And there's the light. Hello out there. And I would ask you, well, first to have a question, but then to wait for the microphone. Right there, please. Hang on one second.
Hi, and thank you. There were a couple names I was expecting to hear here tonight. One was Mick Ware, and the other is Shalabi. Shalabi?
Ahmed Shalabi.
Ahmed Shalabi. Maybe you alluded to him and didn't name him earlier when you spoke about the source of the bad yellow cake and other intelligence.
He's one of them.
One of them. And it's Shalabi and his CIA handler I wanted to talk about. Is there any veracity to the rumor that Maya was his handler in Kurdistan in 2002? No veracity to that. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Then my other question was about...
Maya did a lot of stuff, but not that.
And then Mick Ware had the journalist who at the time in 2002 was working for Time magazine, and then he became CNN correspondent. He had a notorious personal relationship with Zarqawi, Did you use McWare and that relationship in tracking him? Was that helpful to the team?
I mean, we cannot work with a U.S. citizen or task a U.S. citizen to do, but we also can't work with a journalist and put them in harm's way in that way. So we would be prohibited by our own charter of being able to do that. Nonprofits, journalists, yeah.
Anyone else? Gentleman back there.
Hi. First of all, the questions were great, and thank you for answering the questions. I thought it was really excellent. But my question is, why do you think the president wants to discredit the intelligence community? What's in it for the president?
So, I mean, this is just my opinion, and I'm not a psychologist, nor have I ever played one on TV. But
playing one here, however.
I will. Armchair. Honestly, I think it's because, and this is, I can say this was my experience with some elements within the vice president's office and the Pentagon and Doug Feist's shop. When you contradict someone at that level of leadership who is interested in one answer, they want to minimize you and make sure that the optic is you are lesser than and that you don't understand what you're talking about. And that's how we were treated by vice president's office at times and Doug Feist within the Pentagon. And I think Trump does it for the same reason.
There was one more gentleman here in the middle, and then we'll go over there.
Hi, thank you so much.
We'll do it the other way around. Okay, you go first.
You came into the CIA in 1999. Is that right?
I applied in 99, and by the time you got through all the battery of tests and the polygraph, I joined in 2000.
2000. Yeah. My God, what a beginning for you. At that time, even though it was not your focus, were you aware of the noise that John O'Neill was making?
Oh, yeah.
And ignored?
I mean, it wasn't just John O'Neill. Like I said, there were all these women that were analysts at the CIA. They were writing presidential daily briefs explaining to the president and key cabinet makers that al-Qaeda was interested in attacking the United States. And there's a PDB enter into record that you can actually see.
Presidential daily brief.
Presidential, yes, that was written by one of the premier al-Qaeda analysts from the agency that is in the Senate Intelligence Report, and you can find it online.
But what is your, and we'll take your question in a minute, what is your thought about the pre-9/11 separation of information between the FBI and the CIA, which has been so widely commented on, that CIA did not share? I mean, we've discussed this here with other guests before. What's your take on that?
So that's interesting because I've asked, because I wasn't working in CTC prior to 9/11, the Counterterrorism Center, I've asked those questions now that I've had the luxury to sit back and think about it. And every single optic and every little story is just like a pinhole, right? So I watched Looming Tower, and that they didn't even address the fact that there were all these women who were analysts that were in the DI talking about al-Qaeda. Like it was like they didn't exist when you watch Looming Tower. And I think largely because Lawrence Wright didn't know about them when he wrote the book, which by the time you get around to the TV show, they had, they'd been known. But I also have a friend who was a female FBI analyst that was sitting at CIA headquarters prior to 9/11, reading this information, not at Alex Station like you see, depicted,
Tower, yeah,
right? Yeah. So she was talking back and forth to the FBI about the information that the analysts were seeing. So it wasn't this blind eye like you see in some of the TV shows, essentially. If you read through the Senate Intelligence Report, the postmortem of 9/11, they actually go through and tell you who had access to what and what some of the problems were. I mean, there were certainly problems. There were things that were missed and not passed.
Gentleman there, I think, is our next. Yes, if you have the mic, you do.
I do. This is a pretty big question. I was wondering, not difficult, just big, how you saw the intelligence community and the CIA change over the time that you were aware, and how did it change? What were the triggers? Things like that.
Yeah, I mean, the CIA changed dramatically. So when I joined, Bill Clinton's administration was still not, there was a hiring freeze. So when I joined, they were hiring still very few people at that time. And then after 9/11, I mean, one of my first volunteer jobs was calling people who had submitted resumes that could speak Arabic or Urdu and Pashto and see what their availability is. I remember I called a guy who was like 5 minutes before the bell rang on the trading floor in New York. And he's like, I've got 5 minutes. What do you need? I mean, it's odd that I'm like, hi, I'm so-and-so from the CIA. I've got your resume. But it also changed it, I think, in the sense of it's hardened, I think, the CIA in a way that you wouldn't have seen.
How do you mean that?
It was, as we've all seen in the public sphere, the blame stuff that happened after 9/11 of who missed what. And so it was just, excuse my French, balls to the wall after that. I mean, it was like everything you could do to dismantle and get rid of al-Qaeda.
Is that, do you think, part of what led into the enhanced interrogation rendition program?
100%.
You write, at one point you write about someone who was then subjected to this, who you were not involved in deciding that would happen to him, but your contemporaneous thought, and even in retrospect, is, I don't know what I would have done had I been in that position. So explain the position to us and, how you weigh those kinds of factors, because you obviously know what you're doing to this person.
Yeah. So at the time, I didn't have a ton of visits. So this is like a restricted handling program. It's an RH program that only so many people had access to, as far as the detail of what was happening inside this program. So I myself didn't know exactly how this was being, I think utilized is the wrong word.
Well, carried out.
Carried out. Yeah. So at the time, I thought they have this like really specific, structured way of extracting information. I didn't think it all involved, naively, torture. I thought it was like around some of the things that we were doing in Iraq, where it was like you'd get enough information on somebody, and then you would basically, you would either try to trip them up, or you would play to like you do with a case officer. You try to recruit somebody and elicit the information out of them after they trust you, that kind of stuff. I assumed we were using some of the skill sets that we use in our daily intelligence collection life, but that wasn't the case, naively. Did I think they were all sunshine and rainbows? No, I didn't. But I wasn't really super concerned about their well-being always, in the sense of, after you see those guys take responsibility for all of those attacks, it's hard to have a lot of empathy.
And looking back at that moment, then there's an ambiguity in what you would have decided if it had been up to you. That's a question. I'm asking it the right way.
If I would have known then what I know now, I just think the guys who were in charge of that program were crazy. For lack of a better way to put this, but I can't imagine it being useful. What's the utility of it? I wouldn't trust the information.
One more, in the back, your daughter. You can ask your mom questions at home too,
Yeah, but you sure you want to take up?
Here we go.
Hi, Mom.
Hi, Ellie.
What was the hardest thing you had to do? What was harder, being a targeter or an analyst?
Oh, that's a good question. No one's asked me that.
I know. I'm brilliant.
Give the microphone back. I actually think I think it was harder being an analyst. Making those daily calls, being a targeting officer, I mean, that's tough. But being an analyst and especially the analyst, the experience that I had in the run up to the Iraq War and delivering this information to the policymaker to make this decision, it was so, I don't know. That was big.
Well, we're going to let you have the last question. And I do want to thank everybody. I want to remind those of you who are not members, there's a membership table out there. We do encourage people to become members because it helps support these programs. And for those of you who are members, thank you. But really the most important thing now is for us to all join thanking Neda Bakos.
Thank you.
Thank you.